Business Rescue Practitioners who took over South African Airways on the 5th of December last year expect to vote on a restructuring plan on the 14th of July. A decision on SAA was delayed yet again after creditors voted to postpone deliberations on Thursday. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, in his emergency national budget speech on Wednesday, did not allocate new funds to the state-owned enterprise, despite a request from the Business Rescue Practitioners. Additional funding of 10 billion rand is needed to restart the embattled airline, pay retrenchments and cover other overhead costs. The new date for the meeting comes a day before the deadline, a process stretched over 6 months instead of the statutory 25 working days outlined in the Companies Act. Economist Khaya Sithole joins us on the line to chat about the latest developments on SAA. Khaya, thank you so much for your time. Khaya, really appreciate it. I just want to ask immediately, should we still be liquidating SAA or not? Why are we trying to save this company?
Well, I think the difficulty here is that the question of either liquidating or saving SAA is a question of us understanding the consequences of either action. If you are liquidating, then of course it would mean that everybody who's currently employed by SAA in one form or another will immediately become unemployed. If you do rescue it in another form, some people may still keep their jobs, but then the question will be, at what cost are we trying to keep those jobs, and is this the best use of resources? So I do think that the question itself is not an easy one. It's really a matter of trying to figure out what will be the consequences of taking one decision over the other. And I think in this case, the government is obviously gravitating towards saying, let us rescue the airline rather than liquidating the airline. Now, whether a business case has actually been put forward that supports the government's position is still the missing piece of the puzzle, because if you read the business rescue plan, the business rescue plan actually doesn't give a business case for SAA to be saved. It's either it's been badly drafted, or perhaps the parameters and the inputs there are so dire that you actually couldn't build a business case anyway. But that being said, the government is still saying we're going to take this remarkably weak business rescue plan and we're going to actually use it as a basis for rescuing the airline. It's a choice that they've taken. Now they have to finance it.
But I'm looking at the funding of 10 billion rand to save the airline. Is this something that government can actually afford, or is it just a situation of flogging a dead horse?
No, remember, the question of whether government can afford something is always a question of whether government chooses to prioritize something over the other. So the question of affordability is, of course, there is an amount of money somewhere available in the fiscus. But the issue here is that that amount of money may probably better be deployed elsewhere. That amount of money may probably achieve better social outcomes if you spend it on something else. So it's not a question of whether the money is available, but rather the question of if the government is going to make the choice or make the election of prioritizing this particular exercise over any other need that there might be out there. And of course, we know that there's a lot of competing priorities. So if SAA is going to be prioritized, the government will make the call, and that call has to be defended in the public arena. Now, whether the government obviously can explain and articulate why they've made that particular choice is something we'll have to wait and see. So on the question of whether it's a dead horse, again, we are working in a very different situation where the entire global aviation sector has been forced into a lockdown. So, of course, it's difficult to then isolate one entity and say you are a problem. But luckily for us, SAA had already proved to us long before the lockdown that it was indeed a problem. So, again, in the absence of a business plan that shows us how things are going to be done differently than they were done long before the lockdown, it is indeed a dead horse.
What do you think will come out of this restructuring plan come the 14th of July, if things get that far?
The problem with the 14th of July vote is that you've got a very, very strange balance between the people who will be voting. So you've got the big banks who are owed around 16 billion rand who will also be voting in this business plan. And then you've got the people, the creditors and everyone else who's not part of the big bank consortium who will also be voting in this business plan, but technically stands to lose everything. And the reason that's important is that the big banks have got all their monies guaranteed by the state. So the big banks couldn't be bothered whether the plan was 1 page or 1,000 pages. For them, the net results remains the same. They're going to get their money back. The problem comes with the people who stand to lose a lot, whether it's in the form of a liquidation or even indeed in the form of a new restructured airline. So you'd have seen this past week when SAA Link actually tried to block the entire process. It is on the basis that SAA Link is saying we are owed hundreds of millions of rand, and what's been put on the table amounts to us losing a lot of what is owed to us. And even that small fraction that we're going to get, which is around 7.5 cents for every rand that they're owed, even that small fraction is not repayable immediately. It has to be repaid over a 3-year period. So we're not only getting a huge cut on what it is that is due to us, but we're being asked to wait for 3 years to actually recover even that small fraction. So I would think that those creditors who are unsecured are going to be highly aggrieved. And of course, the problem here is that if the big banks decide to vote for this business rescue plan, it would really be representing an unfair vote, an inequitable vote in my opinion, because you've got people who've got nothing to lose being given the same rights as the people who are essentially having to lose or sacrifice everything.
Earlier you spoke about how we know that SAA has been disappointing in terms of earning revenue over the past few years. If you look at how much money government has spent, around 20 billion rand has been given to them in successful bailouts over the past 6 years. Does this just not add to the fact that chances are government is going to just give them the 10 billion rand they're requesting?
In my suspicion, the government is not going to let any employer that employs so many people go under, particularly under the conditions that we're living in. So my view has always been that the government will still decide that they're going to give this amount of money anyway. And there's very little that we as citizens can do to stop them because, again, when you do give a government a 5-year mandate, you actually have to accept that the decisions that they're going to take, you get bound by them whether you like them or not. So given the fact that, there are going to be huge consequences if the government doesn't do what it is that the business rescue plan is asking for, and if the government itself also votes for the business plan, because it also does play a role of a creditor, it will give them the money, and there's very little we can do about it, because even in the February speech, they'd already committed to paying 16 billion rand to rescue this airline, and that 16 billion rand is going to the banks who, in my view, were completely reckless in lending money to an institution that can't even bother to produce financial statements. But of course, they only did that because they knew that the state was always going to bail them out, and there's nothing that we as citizens could do about it. So yes, my suspicion is that somehow they're going to find the 10 billion rand somewhere.
Okay, let's turn it around. If indeed there was a liquidation, planes being sold, etc., and people actually losing their jobs, does this mean that creditors like SAA Link will not receive the money that they invested in SAA?
Well, it's easy to sell aeroplanes if you own them. SAA is not in the habit of owning these things. They're in the habit of leasing them, so they borrow a majority of their fleet. So it's actually just taking those aeroplanes back to their owners. The problem is that those owners would have said to you, we are giving you this for the next 10 or for the next 5 years, and if you decide to bring it back early, we're actually going to charge you because now we're going to be stuck with something that we cannot use. That's how the contracts would have been structured to begin with. Well, it's even worse now when those same companies are going to be saying, not only do we not want anyone to be bringing planes back, we already know that there's going to be a huge backlog because people aren't flying anyway. So there's going to be costs associated with them trying to return those planes, and I think the business rescue team has tried to allocate an amount to that. So that's the first reality that you have to deal with, is that it's going to cost you to even return the planes that you do not own but you have leased. The selling of the planes that you do own, again, it's the absolute worst time to be trying to sell anything, because guess what? Nobody has got a capacity issue. Nobody is looking to buy one additional aeroplane because absolutely nobody's flying. So even if you decide to sell, you're going to be selling at the lowest prices that you can get in the market, which makes absolutely no economic sense. So that's what happens when you decide to either return or to sell your aeroplanes. But of course, if it is indeed a liquidation, the business rescue team has said if it is a liquidation, absolutely not a single cent will be available to pay the creditors. So SAA Link, which is owed hundreds of millions of rand, will get absolutely nothing. And Comair, which is owed close to 800 million rand, will get absolutely nothing.
Do you think it was strategic that the finance minister didn't mention anything about SAA over the past budget speech he did on Wednesday?
I wouldn't want to accuse the minister of having been strategic in leaving everyone in limbo, because you cannot have a government that is saying in one cabinet statement exactly 24 hours after he delivers a speech that they've committed to rescuing an airline, and the finance minister to it. So if the finance minister knew that there'd been a cabinet meeting, which he had been sitting in that morning, that had made the call that this must be rescued, and they were going to put this in a cabinet statement the day after, it is inconceivable how he then decided to omit it from his speech, because we now know that the next next time he's going to be delivering any form of a speech is going to be in the October medium-term budget speech. And in that, you hardly ever get new commitments. It's always just a reaffirmation of what's already been there. So no, there is nothing good. There is nothing to be commended about the fact that the politicians are playing this ridiculous game of speaking past each other and leaving the rest of us wondering and speculating what happens next.
Khaya, my final question, just want to find out, I mean, at this stage where we are with SAA amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, is there a chance and a possibility that privatizing SAA is still a possibility?
Privatization is always a possibility. It's a question of what are the terms and the conditions. Now, it's going to be difficult to imagine that any rational business investor will want to actually invest in SAA if the government maintains the type of interference, the type of destructive interference, we must say, that is practiced in the past. Because in that case, it would mean that SAA in any form is still going to end up in the same type of doldrums that it was in before. So any person that is entertaining a bid of buying any part of SAA or owning any part of SAA is going to have to be very clear to the state about what the parameters are and what the limitations of what the investor versus the state is allowed to do. So I would suspect that if you want to do that, you're going to be very, very clear, and the government is going to decide whether they want to do that. My suspicion is that the government has got this massive ideological obsession with owning an aviation asset, even though they now know they do not have the capacity to run it. All they can do is simply destroy it. So the fact that the government has got this ideological obsession means that they are unlikely to let it go in full. So it's going to be a mixed model of ownership between that private investor, whoever they are, whoever they are that's crazy enough to invest in an airline in this climate, and of course the state insisting on keeping a particular stake.
Independent analyst Khaya Sithole chatting to us about the latest developments surrounding SAA Business Rescue Practitioners. They're set to vote on a restructuring plan on the 14th of July, a day before their deadline. A big thank you to Khaya Sithole for his time.